The knock on the door came just as her hands trembled while fixing her dress, the same second-hand navy blue one she'd worn to a job interview months ago. She had never done this before, never gone on a blind date, never opened her heart to a stranger. But something about today, something about the stillness in her tiny apartment and the persistent ache in her chest, made her say yes. With her 7-year-old son quietly watching cartoons in the bedroom and her nerves twisting like threads in a storm, she opened the door, only to freeze as the man before her leaned slightly in and whispered, "My kids are in the car." Right then, everything around her seemed to stop, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of children's laughter on the TV, even her heartbeat. She wasn't sure what startled her more, the sudden vulnerability in his voice, or the raw truth in his eyes. For a moment, her instincts screamed to shut the door, to return to the safe discomfort of loneliness. But something made her stay. Something in his tone felt familiar, like a mirror held up to her soul. Backhand index pointing right. If you believe in the power of kindness, second chances, and love that finds you when you've almost given up, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Rapple of Hope. Every gesture helps us continue sharing stories that heal and uplift. Her name was Eliza. 32 years old. A single mom who wore resilience like a coat she never had the luxury to take off. Life hadn't handed her any favors. Her ex walked out the door when their son was just 2, and she had spent the last 5 years bouncing between part-time jobs, juggling bills, school runs, and silent tears under the shower. The world saw her as strong. But inside, she was just tired, not of motherhood, never of that, but of always being alone in the struggle. Tonight wasn't about seeking love, it was more about testing whether her heart still remembered how to hope. His name was Malcolm. Tall, with tired brown eyes and a nervous smile that made him look more boyish than he probably felt. He stood at her doorstep like a man carrying invisible luggage. When he whispered those words, "My kids are in the car," it wasn't some line, some trick. It was a confession. A warning. A plea for honesty in return. Eliza hesitated, then stepped outside in her worn heels. She peered over his shoulder, expecting maybe one child, but instead, she saw 2. A girl and a boy, both around 5 or 6, sitting quietly in the back seat of a modest sedan. The little girl hugged a faded teddy bear, while the boy clutched a tablet with a cracked screen. Malcolm turned to look at them too, then whispered again, this time more softly, "I didn't want to lie. They're part of me. I can't pretend they're not." And something in Eliza broke, not in a bad way, but in the way a locked door finally creaks open. So she did something unexpected. She smiled, shaky but genuine, and said, "Then let's go say hi." That night didn't turn out to be a date at all. Instead, they drove together to a quiet diner, the kind where kids could order pancakes for dinner without judgment. Their children warmed up to each other faster than the adults did, giggling over spilled syrup and fighting over crayons. And Eliza, who hadn't laughed freely in years, found herself chuckling at Malcolm's corny jokes and gentle parenting. They talked about everything, not just the good, but the hard stuff. How Malcolm had lost his wife 3 years ago in a car accident that turned his world upside down. How he had to quit his job in sales to care for his kids full-time. How hard it was being a father and a mother. How lonely it felt, even with 2 children clinging to your every breath. And Eliza told him how it felt to live paycheck to paycheck, how scary it was when her son got pneumonia last winter and she had to choose between buying medicine or paying rent. How sometimes she went without dinner just to make sure he never knew hunger. How love, to her, felt like a distant dream meant for people with fewer scars. That night, when they dropped her off, there was no kiss, no promises. Just a quiet look between 2 people who had seen each other without pretense, and understood. Days turned into weeks, and the texts became calls. The calls became visits. Soon, their children began calling each other best friends, and begging for sleepovers. Malcolm would bring over homemade spaghetti and let her rest while he cleaned the kitchen. Eliza would help with his daughter's hair, something he never quite learned to do right. They weren't perfect. They had arguments. Insecurities crept in like old ghosts. Eliza feared she wasn't enough, not pretty enough, not stable enough. Malcolm worried he was moving on too fast, betraying the memory of his late wife. But every time they stumbled, they came back, not because it was easy, but because they both knew what it felt like to be left behind. One evening, months later, as they all picnicked in the park under fading orange skies, Malcolm reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Eliza's heart stopped. But instead of proposing, he opened it to reveal 2 matching rings, simple, engraved bands, and whispered, "Not for marriage. Not yet. But to promise that no matter what comes, we choose to stay." They slipped the rings on, not just for themselves, but for their children watching with wide, hopeful eyes, kids who had once known too much pain, but now knew what healing looked like. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no mansion, no dramatic makeover. Just 2 hearts, 2 lives, slowly stitching themselves back together with threads of patience, laughter, and hard-won trust. Backhand index pointing right if this story moved you. If you've ever felt unseen, unloved, or afraid to hope again, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Rapple of Hope. These real, raw stories can be a light for someone else walking through the dark. Speech balloon special request, comment below. Have you ever had a moment where love or kindness surprised you when you least expected it? We'd love to hear your story.